I was diagnosed as autistic when I was 24, and I would say, bold statement, the amount that my life is affected by autism, by being autistic, an equal, if not greater amount, I am affected by the trauma of being autistic.
What was once a neurological disability has become a personality profile. Almost anyone who's uncomfortable in social settings can claim a spot on the spectrum.
I have autism. I have ADHD. I am an actor.
How have we gone from diagnosing children with severe life-limiting impairments to diagnosing adult women who watched Sheldon and saw themselves in him? Welcome back to Psychobabble, where we expose bad therapy and the liberal narratives that contribute to our poor mental health. I'm Hannah Spear. Please like and subscribe and upgrade your membership and become a Psychobabble Insider to join us in the members exclusive video at the end of this. As you see here, when Leo Kanner introduced the term infantile autism in 1943, he wasn't talking about socially awkward, misunderstood introverts. He was describing kids with profound impairments, nonverbal, withdrawn, and these kids didn't just struggle socially, they struggled to function. And for decades, that's what autism meant. Rare, severe, and unmistakable. Then came psychiatry's long march of diagnostic expansion. I'm showing you a table here that clearly shows what this diagnosis looked like through the years, through the different revisions of the DSM. In the DSM-3 in the 1980s, the diagnosis requirements for autism, this was then called infantile autism and had to be diagnosed before 30 months. These were marked lack of language development, gross deficits in social interaction, and restricted and repetitive behaviors, as you see in this video.
Ivan is 9 now, and he cannot talk, but he can hum. He sometimes hums the basic melody of a Beethoven symphony. Ivan is a sensitive child, in the way he handles things, in the way he hates unpleasant sounds as much as he loves pleasant ones.
These were not on a spectrum. There was no autism spectrum. These were clear developmental abnormalities. In the decades that followed, it remained a narrowly defined diagnosis. But then in the 80s and 90s, things began to shift. Asperger's syndrome was introduced. And these were essentially high IQ individuals with social difficulties. By the 1960s and 70s, they estimated the prevalence around 4 to 5 kids per 10,000. Then, as you see here in the DSM-3R in 1987, they introduced PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, and autistic disorder. So this already widened the net. There was less emphasis on language and IQ, and they included subclinical cases. Then with the DSM-4 in 1994, things started to really change. Here, Asperger's syndrome emerges as a distinct entity within the diagnosis. And these are high IQ individuals with social impairments. And this is when the floodgates started to open. And in comes DSM-5 in 2013. And here this spectrum model begins. They eliminated the subtypes, collapsed everything into one diagnosis, the autism spectrum disorder, and allowed patients to meet only 6 of 12 criteria. 3 criteria in the social communications domain, and 2 of 4 criteria in the restrictive repetitive behavior domain. But in practice, patients only have to fulfill 6 out of 12 criteria in any of these clusters, which means the symptoms may only be socially flavored, which means you can have a person diagnosed with autism who struggles with conversations, has trouble making friends, has odd body language, uses an unusual tone of voice, has a preference for routine, and highly focused interests. And that is often up for interpretation. But let me ask you, does this sound like a serious developmental disorder? Or does this sound like a shy teenager, a quirky academic, or someone who's just never been disciplined socially? I mean, I took one of these tests, the usual questionnaire, the AQ, and I scored quite high. I'm very rigid. I like eating the same things every day. Going camping is my worst nightmare, and find, social situations tiring. I mean, my own family jokingly says that both of us are on the spectrum. So we're classic conscientious introverts. And people tend to find this odd, which is fine. It's our personality. They also removed having to be diagnosed as a child. You can fulfill the criteria historically, so that now the typical autist patient looks like a verbally gifted female adult in her 20s.
I thought I was the most anxious person ever, okay? Social anxiety through the roof. Turns out it was autism the whole time. So here are some things I thought were related to anxiety and social anxiety that turned out to be related to autism. So 1, I'd have anxiety attacks all the time, out of nowhere, incontrollable, exhausting. They'd last ages. I'd be rocking, stimming, throwing hands, just so emotional, ridiculous. And they'd be like, whoa, you're so anxious. Autistic meltdown. 2, I'd go quiet in group settings. I'd hate them. I'd be so anxious. I wouldn't be able to speak. I'd be quiet, especially with larger personalities. No, I was overwhelmed, overstimulated, struggling to keep up with social cues, experiencing selective mutism or a shutdown even. Then I'd come back and probably have a meltdown. And I thought my social battery was just dead from social anxiety, even one-on-one, but I was just trying to mask. That's why I was exhausted and trying to keep up.
So in these few decades, autism has become so elastic, it no longer requires measurable developmental delays, language delays, or cognitive impairments. What was once a neurological disability has become a personality profile. Almost anyone who's uncomfortable in social settings, especially the chronically anxious, can claim a spot on the spectrum.
I have autism. I have ADHD. I am an actor.
How have we gone from diagnosing children with severe life-limiting impairments to diagnosing adult women who watched Sheldon and saw themselves in him? This could only happen because psychiatry has failed to gatekeep against culture and ideology. The term neurodivergent popped up in the 90s from a sociologist called Judy Singer. And this was a part of a larger move towards neurodiversity. And this was meant to frame neurological conditions like autism and ADHD not as pathologies, but as variations of human behavior. But here is one of the many problems with that. This framework smuggles in an essentialist and pseudo-religious worldview, where identity is not only fixed and innate, but morally protected. It purposefully collapses the distinction between disorder and difference, making all variants equal. And once that move is made, psychiatry loses its ability to speak in terms of impairment and dysfunction. So neurodivergence in this model is no longer a clinical category. It's a moral identity. And that was always the intention.
Take it from Judy Singer herself.
It was a perfect word for the times because it combined the fashions of the time, which was the rise of neuroscience over psychology. People were fed up with paying fortunes for therapy and not changing. Neuroscience seemed to improve. And the green movement, diversity as a desirable thing for any ecosystem. And I thought, why not put them together? So what does it mean? It means, well, it's a fancy word for all humanity, but don't tell anyone that because... But what it doesn't mean is it's not a disability. It's like, you know, Joey the kangaroo's got a bad case of biodiversity. No, it doesn't mean disability. But basically, I didn't define it, but I said what it was for. I wanted to name a social movement for in the mould of the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement, for people who were neurological outsiders or neurological minorities, as I prefer to call them now. And the other, that was to name the movement, and the other thing was to add to intersectionality, because in those days, disability was just physical, intellectual, and mental illness, and that wasn't us.
This neurodiversity paradigm, it borrows from postmodern relativism, which, as we've talked about before, resists hierarchical judgment of traits, of personality traits, and social constructivism. And that insists that what we call normal is just what society rewards. So with this, the person who can't sit still in a classroom isn't disordered. They're oppressed by a neurotypical system. And here's the problem with that. Why can't we just be nice? When everything's reframed as different and not disorder, the burden of adjustment shifts entirely to society and away from the individual. And this allows the idea that one's inner state justifies outward exemption. And in practice, that means disruption in classrooms is excused and not addressed. I just had a couple of weeks ago someone coming to in the school of my kids saying, yeah, well, you know, now we know why she spit on the other students. And that's, you know, it's such a relief to everyone that we now know why. We also allow for narcissistic fragility to be called sensory overwhelm. And you don't have to contend with your rejection sensitivity because it's neurodivergent pain. And if you have a deep aversion to feedback, that is masking trauma. So this creates a closed moral loop where you can't challenge the behavior because the behavior is identity, and to question identity is to do harm. And clinically, this flattens the entire field because it no longer matters what the dysfunction is. It matters how the patient feels about it. It's identity consumerism, and it turns the clinician into a sort of spiritual affirmator. Where they're not there to diagnose, but to validate a belief system, to hand out sacraments of self-definition under the guise of medical legitimacy. So what might have begun for some as a movement for inclusion, and certainly the famous autist Temple Grandin, she was happy for this term neurodivergence because she looked at her autism as a gift. But paradoxically, it's become an exclusionary ideology. Because it now alienates those who truly are impaired, while it valorizes the performatively eccentric. Like, take a look at this.
My mother and I are both professionally diagnosed with autism and ADHD. I was diagnosed early, and she was diagnosed late, at age 48.
And here is where it becomes theological, because neurodivergence doesn't just function as a label anymore. It's a worldview. It's a personal gospel. When someone tells you I'm neurodivergent, or more commonly, my child is neurodivergent, they're not disclosing a clinical detail. They're declaring a lens through which everything is interpreted. Relationships, politics, ethics, and so it becomes religious in nature. The creation stories, I was born different. So society has to accommodate for healing to occur. And the moral code is you challenge me and it's ableism. You validate me, it's allyship. And there's a distinct ritual lexicon, which includes masking, stimming, unmasking, safe space. And they've even found a way to frame conflict as failure of the neurotypical world to understand and accommodate them. And that's how critique becomes heresy. You're attacking their sacred narrative. And you can see this. People have erupted in outrage towards me online because I have come out and said this, and I'm attacking their identity. That is how it feels to them. And they are completely incapable of mustering any sympathy for those who are left behind by this development.
Imagine if we diagnose neurotypical people in the same judgmental way we diagnose neurodivergents. Cannot possibly survive more than 30 seconds of silence without mentioning the weather. Must maintain intense eye contact at all times, or else they'll think you're lying or rude. They will talk to a cashier differently to how they would talk to a CEO.
The neurotypical need to exert control over every autistic person's life. I swear this is why autistic people don't do well in corporate jobs. The people above them feel the need to control every move they make and criticize everything they're doing because it's not exactly like everybody else. Autistic people have different ways of doing things that might get the same results, that might get better results actually. But the higher ups are not interested in new ideas. They're not interested in new methods, and they're mad if you're not falling in line and looking and acting and dressing exactly like everyone else.
Let's walk through some of the few defining traits of autism. You've probably heard of stimming, which are repetitive movements for self-regulation. They're often rhythmic, so hand flapping or rocking or spinning or humming. These aren't cute quirks. In real autism, these are involuntary, and they're very, very hard to suppress. It's not a chosen aesthetic. It interferes with daily functioning. And this is an example of someone who's chosen this trait as a cute quirk, as a stimming is for cluster B patients, what they do voluntary to self-regulate. It's something that they'll go to a corner and do to calm down.
I want you to stay till I'm in the grave.
Another example is echolalia, which is when they repeat words or phrases from parents or TV, like immediate echolalia will be like, do you want this? Or do you want juice? And the kid will say, want juice? Want juice? This is an example of that.
How you doing, buddy?
How you doing, buddy?
You having a good day?
Good day.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Having a good Saturday?
Good Saturday.
Got a soda?
A soda.
You want to have spaghetti for dinner? You like spaghetti?
This is a language processing issue. So the child can mimic, but they can't generate original speech. That's more difficult for them. And then the cluster B patients have taken this and said they have internalized echolalia. What they mean is more that they're haunted by something in the evening, which is very normal for people to have. That you go over something that you think you did wrong, or where you wish you'd have a different response in a conversation. That comes from excess neuroticism and your anxiety from that given situation or the thing that it triggers in you. It doesn't come from a language processing issue, which this is. And so here you can see that.
If you're ADHD or autistic, do you already know about this internalized echolalia, or am I just like this late to the game? Last night I was watching a video someone made and I'm like, wait, not everybody does this? Not everybody has song lyrics in their head or a conversation that's never gonna happen playing out? Something somebody said to me years ago that's just on loop. It's not even like a song I just heard. It would be like the Land Before Time theme song, just up there while I'm trying to sleep, when I'm trying to get ready for bed, or like a totally random song that I don't even want to have up there. Whip it good. And then there's the show quotes and movie quotes. Sometimes I swear I even have two things going on at least, like a song over here, up here, and a conversation up here. I don't know. I just thought everyone was like this.
Autists are very rigid, very routine dependent, as we've mentioned. They'll feel internal distress when routines are broken, which leads to these obsessive traits, obsessive rituals around clothing or eating. And it's very difficult for them to go through transitions. Going from one activity to another can cause a sensory overload, a meltdown. And this is not a personality preference. This is a neurological distress when predictability is removed, and it comes from an executive dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, we think, that leads to this difficulty with planning and shifting and flexible thinking. The fourth thing is it's a sensory dysregulation. So they have a hypersensitivity to light and sound and sometimes smell, and then hyposensitivity sometimes to pain or cold. And that is not simply, I didn't like wearing, when I was a kid, I didn't like wearing a certain kind of textile. I mean, all kids have very sensitive skin and they don't like to wear wool. They like, if they can choose, they'll go around in their pajamas the whole day. And kids are doing that now. I'm not kidding. They're going around in their pajamas for most of the day because parents can't bear this going through this transition with them that no, you have to wear proper clothes outside. So you see a lot of kids now with these not pajama overalls with the rabbit ears. It's very common. And it's because kids are very sensitive to textiles. So in this reel, you'll see this cluster B patients talking about how she's autistic because when she was a kid, she didn't like to wear certain textiles. That is not fulfilling the diagnostic criteria.
You know how you cut the tags out of all of your clothes? Yeah, that's the autism. What about when I cut the underwire out of my bra? That's the autism. What about when I roll up all of my long sleeves so that nothing is touching my wrists? Also the autism. Okay, but what about the fact that I can't step on the floor with bare feet? I think you already know the answer to this. It's the autism. It's the autism.
What happens in the autistic brain? What is the original neurological theory of autism? The psychologist Leo Kanner, who coined the term autism, and then later Uta Frith, they thought of it as a deficit in central coherence, meaning that autistic individuals had a tendency to focus very intently on parts, on details and recognizing pattern, but that they had trouble integrating them as a whole, and so seeing the abstract whole. And so that would lead them to obsess about things like trains or things, because this was predominantly a male and disorder that affected males. So then comes the interest in things. And if you listen to Temple Grandin, she's written books about this. She calls it that her thinking is bottom up. So she thinks not in language, she thinks in visuals, detail oriented. So she calls it visual intelligence and separates that from verbal intelligence. And then other neurological theories say that this is predominantly a left brain dominance. And we've talked about this with Ian McGilchrist on the show, that the left brain favors logic and detail processing over this holistic integration, holistic way of thinking. And autists, they have a difficult time when things are changed, because it then changes the way that they look at the whole picture. So if you change something in a room, for them it's a different room because they are not able to do that abstract representation of seeing it's the same room but something is in a different place. And so some researchers say that this means there is an underdevelopment of the right hemisphere in autistic kids. And this all mainly means that there's a different way of processing information. And that difference comes with real impairments, especially in involving abstraction, empathy, and relational flexibility. When we speak to each other, often it's open-ended. You have to extract what we mean in social situations, and for autists that's quite difficult to do. For that, you need a theory of mind, and that was theorized by Simon Baron-Cohen in the 80s, theory of mind. And that is the ability to recognize that other people have thoughts and feelings and perceptions of their own, and with that intentions that are different than your own. And little kids, they don't have that. They develop that by the age of 4 or 5, and autists, they don't develop this, which is why they come across unkind. They struggle with sarcasm. They struggle with lies and subtext. Just like a little kid is not able to conceptualize lying, because it just assumes that you know everything that they know. The result of this DSM expansion of the diagnosis is that in the last 20 years alone, we've seen a 241% increase in the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. It went from Leo Kanner estimating 4 or 5 kids per 10,000 to the CDC estimating that 1 in 36 kids have this disorder. That's almost 1 autistic child per classroom. And my question is, who opened the floodgates? Because diagnostic inflation doesn't just happen. It's built through activism, lobbying, and ideology. One of the culprits were the ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They have been the most politically active group shaping the current diagnosis, particularly active during the DSM revision from 2009 to 2012. And they were particularly worried that that collapsing the Asperger's and the PDD, not otherwise specified diagnoses, into one spectrum would cause higher functioning individuals, particularly women, to lose access to services. They also lobbied hard for wording that allowed people to qualify based on symptoms currently or historically recorded, which led to, as I mentioned, adults claiming the diagnosis, saying that, well, as a kid, I was like this and that, very often not possible to verify at all. And they also wanted explicit protection for late diagnosed adults. So to be very clear, this wasn't about clinical precision. This was about diagnostic access. And then, of course, there's the neurodiversity movement, spearheaded by people like Nick Walker, Steve Silberman, and they wanted to reframe autism not as a disorder, but like as a natural variation of brain wiring. And they wanted us to think that the social difficulties experienced by autists, that they were caused by neurotypical norms, not autistic traits. And this movement was really responsible for rebranding autism as an identity, a culture, and a protective class. And they wanted, for example, lived experience and self-identification to be just as valid as a formal clinical diagnosis. And in these decades, we have had over 2,000 papers studying autism, flawed studies that have been stretched and spun and selectively cited to justify a total redefinition of what autism is. But there are some studies that do point to the flawed nature of the current diagnosis and why we're seeing such a high prevalence. One was in 2006 by someone called Shattuck, and this study showed that the rise in autism in the 90s and the 2000s mirrored a drop in other diagnoses like intellectual disability and language disorders. So that means same kids, but different labels. So because autism had such strong advocacy, so much funding, so much more social sympathy, kids that would have gotten these other diagnoses were now put into this balloon called autism spectrum disorder. This was also shown in 2009 by King and Behrman. They showed that 60% of the rise in autism prevalence could be explained by changes in diagnosis and reporting alone. They showed that this autism epidemic wasn't about more children becoming autistic. It was about forms being filled out differently. And the neurodiversity movement, they had some theorists on their side, obviously. One of these were Damien Milton. He coined the term double empathy problem, and in all of the neurodivergence circles, you'll hear about this double empathy problem. Let's have TikTok explain it.
If you're neurodivergent, did you know that the double empathy theory says that while neurotypical and autistic people struggle to communicate between neurotypes, actually if you put just neurotypical people in a group or just autistic people in a group, they will actually communicate very effectively amongst themselves. I think this is really interesting. So here's an example of what that can look like. Dr. Beth Rodolsky, I'm autistic and I have a PhD specializing in neurodiversity. As an autistic person, sometimes I struggle to predict what neurotypical people are going to want from me in a given social situation. It's not even that I can't read signs, it's that after I read the behavior and I notice that something weird happened, I'm like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do in response to this. Put me with my neurodivergent friends and like we'll be in a grocery store and I will pick the second they will be tipped over the edge of overstimulation. Like immediately I see that like far off look in their eye and they're just kind of like staring off into nowhere down the aisle and I'm like, okay, it's too bright, it's too loud, too many advertisements, too many choices, analysis paralysis. Yep, I get it. Follow me, let's go. I'll take care of the checkout and you take the keys and you go out to the car. Like I can just immediately empathize.
Damien Milton himself writes about the double empathy problem, that the relational issues are not due to autistic cognition alone, but a breakdown in reciprocity and mutual understanding that can happen between people with very differing ways of experiencing the world. If one has ever experienced a conversation with someone who one does not share a first language with, or even an interest in the topic of a conversation, one may experience something similar. So by this logic, if someone behaves rudely or lashes out, it's not a social failure. It's your lack of empathy towards the autistic person. So it flips the moral burden entirely. And the same with the other theory that they came up with, which was masking. And this was a way of including adults who hadn't been diagnosed previously, adult women mainly, saying that girls mimic social norms to avoid bullying or to fit in. But the problem is that both of these works are built on self-report and interpretation.
If this sounds like you might be an autistic female. Hi, I'm Megan, and I'm late diagnosed autistic at 32 years old. So I was just rereading through my autism evaluation today, and I came across my CAT-Q scores, which indicate whether or not you're high masking or not, and mine are off the charts high. So I pulled up the CAT-Q assessment on embraceautism.com, and I came across this, and listen to this, okay? The higher your camouflaging score, the less autistic you likely appear. And the less autistic you appear, the more difficult it is to identify your autism. Consequently, a lot of autistic people that camouflage their autistic traits either have their diagnosis delayed, are misdiagnosed, or escape diagnosis completely. As early as 1981, Lorna Wing, the British psychiatrist and pioneer of autism practice, hypothesized that some autistic girls without an intellectual disability may escape diagnosis on account of appearing to have better social and communication abilities compared to males. Okay, so some ways that I learned to camouflage and mask my autism as I was growing up. Okay, one is that I spent so much time, especially as a young teen, researching social communication and memorizing it and learning these scripts to apply. I remember back to as young as kindergarten, looking around my classroom, not knowing how to exist as a human, and just like intently observing all of the other kids, learning how to behave and what to do, and then copying and mimicking their behavior. Okay, 3 is that I forced eye contact, and things like hugs and physical touch both make me feel incredibly uncomfortable. Okay, and 4 is that I'm always acutely aware of my body language, my tone of voice, my expression, and I'm having to constantly manually program all of that when I'm in social interactions. So if you're like me and you thought you probably aren't autistic because you don't present in this very obvious stereotypical way, but you are a very heavy masker and you resonate with the points that I just made, it may be because of camouflaging.
For example, another study you'll hear cited in neurodivergent circles is from 2017, Hull. This was the one that introduced masking as a cause of mental distress for autistic people. And the study is called Putting on My Best Normal. What this study did, it surveyed 92 self-identified autistic adults. The mean age was 39. Over 50% of them were women, but there was no clinical verification of the diagnoses. They were online participants recruited from forums and advocacy groups. And here's the kicker. Most of these 92 autists were diagnosed above the age of 30. The methodology was all qualitative, open-ended responses, and purely a subjective interpretation. No control group, no comparison. It was personal storytelling analyzed for patterns. That matters because what's being described is suppressing behavior, adjusting speech, mirroring others, which is not diagnostic of autism. Everyone does that. All people who are high in neuroticism do that. I do that. When we go on a first date, when we interview for a job, when we grit our teeth at a family dinner, we do that. We're all masking. It's called socializing. There's nothing wrong with it. But God forbid you should be normal. So when this study labels masking as a uniquely autistic distress pattern, I kid you not, it's pathologizing what's actually a universal coping strategy, something that you should be taught when you're growing up. So what it's really doing, it's defining autism not as a neurological deficit, but by emotional fatigue from having to conform to social norms, which according to social constructivism is a bad thing. But this is, so here's where I just can't compute. I read this and I thought, if someone can mask their behavior and you're masking your behavior for 36 years, that means it tells me that you can choose to regulate your behavior, right? Depending on the context, you can choose to do so, but it causes you fatigue. Okay. Isn't that more consistent with personality than with developmental impairment? Isn't that, if that causes you, if conforming to social norms causes you so much distress, that sounds to me more like a personality disorder rather than a developmental impairment. So next time you hear masking is a diagnostic trait, typically found in autistic girls, remember, this idea was pushed by a movement with an agenda, not built on brain scans or developmental data, but built on self-report in adults and an ideology. If you look at these videos, these are clearly cluster B patients. These are girls with a cluster B personality disorder. That's borderline histrionic narcissism and antisocial. The psychopaths, the sociopaths, they're in this cluster of personality disorders. And what we know about patients who develop cluster B personality disorders is that they're not socialized properly in early childhood. They have attachment disorders. They have had very difficult childhoods, and many never learn to be polite and friendly in human interactions. But they have the opposite. We spoke about the theory of mind. They have no problem understanding that other people can lie, that other people have different feelings, which makes them master manipulators. They're very good at ascertaining what you feel and how to get you to feel guilty, to feel ashamed, to make the situation go in their favor, to fill their emotional needs at the moment, which they feel very acutely always. So this is very different from autists, where autists don't understand jokes, they don't understand humor. The cluster B patients, they will be offended by jokes. They'll feel rejection and slight. They'll have no trouble understanding it. So the theory of mind is intact, but the empathy isn't there, which is why I think that the neurodivergents now, the ones who label themselves autists or go in search of this diagnosis, they don't stop until they find a clinician who will give them the diagnosis.
Thank you. Autism. I'm diagnosing you with autism.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I was going to cry.
No, don't. That's okay.
Or the mothers who search for that diagnosis for their children, there's a deep narcissism in that.
How are you? I'm okay.
Hear my brother say, yo, what's up, buzz nut?
I want to be special. I want to be accommodated too. They think because we have put intellectualism on a pedestal, because we're showed Sherlock and Sheldon and all these other characters who are just super aspirational geniuses, they equate being an autist with being a special genius. And there's this one funny clip from Sherlock that demonstrates this perfectly, where he says, I'm a high-functioning sociopath, do your research, and he's so cool, and we find him sympathetic for some reason.
Not a psychopath, Anderson. I'm a high-functioning sociopath. Do your research.
So we can read her emails, so what?
Anderson, don't talk out loud. You lower the IQ of the whole street. The name's Sherlock Holmes and the address is 221B Baker Street.
And they think that, yeah, I'm just such a genius that I can pretend to be normal whenever it suits me. This makes them edgy without ever having to leave the basement. And the really funny thing is that teenagers have been saying this forever. They have been claiming to be edgy since the dawn of time. Oh, I'm so deep and everyone else is so fake and phony. If you watched a movie from 1955 with Dean James? Oh, I'm going to get flack for not remembering this name, but the movie is called Rebel Without a Cause. And even there, society is so phony. I'm the only one who's real. And this is exactly that. Everyone else conform to social norms. They're so phony and fake. I'm the only one who's genius enough to not want to do what they expect me to do. So stupid.
I am autistic, and it's not that I can't read social cues, it's actually that everyone else is fake. You guys all lie to each other, and then expect me to not point it out, and then you say that I'm socially awkward.
And so with women who are high in narcissistic traits, this is perfect for them. It's Munchausen's by proxy, except better, because now they can say, look, my child is different, he's just more intelligent than everyone else, because for them that's what autism is. You're just so intelligent that you can't conform to social norms. You're just too clever to respond to normal people. And they'll say, like, I always knew he was different. And they'll express outrage if someone says, your child doesn't look like an autist. And if you hear their stories, they'll always say the same thing. We went to so many specialists before we got the diagnosis. And they think that tells you what a good mother they were, how much they cared, that they wouldn't stop until they got to the truth. But to me, that says, okay, so you shopped around. with the agenda of getting this diagnosis, and you manage to manipulate the situation, giving the right answer, coaching your child along the way until you got that stamp. And of course teachers will comply with them. They're having this kid who can't behave in classrooms, and they want their jobs to be easier. They want a better everyday life. So of course they'll fill out the forms. When we're seeing a trend like this, we have to ask who benefits. One, parents who won't discipline their children or can't. When a child is rude or violent or disrupts or defiant, it's hard to correct. And in too many homes, the fathers aren't present or they're shushed, so boundaries are nowhere to be found. Structure is nowhere to be found. But so the diagnosis offers a shortcut, an explanation. It's not bad parenting. It's neurodivergence. It's being extra special. So guilt, accountability, and responsibility are lifted. They're raising a misunderstood genius. And now the school, other kids, the teachers, they all have to adapt, not the child. Oh, now we know why he spit on us. 2, teenage girls and young adult women with cluster B traits who don't want that diagnosis. Emotional dysregulation, unstable self-images, rejection sensitivity, dramatic shifts in mood, relational conflicts. They should be red flags for personality disorders, not late diagnosed autism. But with that, instead of treatment, they receive validation. Instead of working to improve behavior, they're praised for unmasking. Instead of confronting their inner emotional turmoil and chaos, they're protected by disability rights laws. 3, autism specialists and experts and advocates. Because obviously, we talked about this when it came to the trauma diagnosis. When the diagnosis and definitions are wide enough, the field grows and your power with it. More clients, more funding, more relevance. And who's going to push back? Not schools, not parents, not therapists being called ableist. No, this is job security disguised as compassion. And who loses? Who loses? The cognitively impaired child who gets pushed aside, the neurotypical student who's being told to tolerate the being spit on with a smile, and definitely not the public who's being gaslit into thinking that basic discipline is oppression. There's a real cost to this insistence on being compassionate and tolerant, and we're seeing it in psychiatry. And nobody's pointing it out. This is not kindness. In the end, we have to answer just one question. Why are we concerned with diagnosis at all? It's so we can apply the correct treatment. That's the only reason. What is the correct treatment to apply in this case? And we keep losing. And the more we widen the diagnostic categories, the more difficult that becomes to ascertain their own purposes. And yet again, we have failed the true sufferers. And that concludes the free episode of Psychobabble. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll upgrade and become a Psychobabble Insider so we can go on to talk about what proper treatment means, what it doesn't mean, and also the MMR vaccine and autism.
Here's a short preview of that.
And here's another example of how cluster B girls are claiming the autism diagnosis and using these sort of therapies to get what they have always fantasized about, because cluster B girls are always pining for the care and attention that they didn't get from their parents. And so all their fantasies center around parental coddling, metaphorically going back into the womb. So these new treatments of autism, it is their fantasy made real. Just look at this girl. She's having a cocoon made while she is imitating Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter.
So this is my sensory swing. I still get questions about it, so here we go. Sensory swings can be used to apply deep pressure, which can be very calming for autistic people.